Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for this super great event. I'm super excited about all these talks and also horrified by the data, which have horrible implications, but and I'll present more of those for you here. So, but I'm really honored to be here. So a little bit about me. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I use imaging, EEG, methods primarily to understand episodic memory, the mechanisms underlying episodic memory across the adult lifespan. This is memory for personally experienced events. I'm really interested in the various factors related to race and ethnicity that can explain or moderate racial and ethnic disparities in cognition and health. And my interest in this area is somewhat informed by my personal experience as a Mexican-American woman from an immigrant family and my family's lived experiences. One example of my grandmother being diagnosed with dementia when she was in her mid-50s. That was a misdiagnosis. We came to realize later she was undereducated and didn't speak English very well at all, really. So now we've come to understand she was not tested in the way she should have been. So I'll get to that later. Just to set the stage a little bit, there are racial and ethnic minority disparities in Alzheimer's disease prevalence. And as the number of people over the age of 65 is expected to triple by 2060, it's hugely important to understand, obviously, all the various factors underlying Alzheimer's disease, but the factors that are underlying these disparities as well. And you can just see some statistics here. So emerging research suggests there are many possible predictive factors for which there are also disparities between minoritized and non-Hispanic white adults. For example, using data from an annual phone survey of about 378,000 cognitively unimpaired older people in the United States, Neonago and colleagues calculated the self-reported prevalence of known dementia risk factors for these racial and ethnic groups here. They then use those data to calculate what's called population attributable risk percentages for each factor. And this is based on the self-reported prevalence of those factors, as well as from the existing literature, the weight that each of those risk factors carries for dementia. So, for example, what they found in this study was that midlife obesity carries a higher risk for Black older adults than the other groups, and low education carries a higher Alzheimer's disease risk in Hispanic older adults. So before moving on, I want to clarify how we think about race and ethnicity. And this is how we think about it in my lab, but this is generally how people who study this think about it as well. So race is a socio-political construct that divides people into, sorry, I'm getting a error message up here, but I'll just ignore that. That divides people into groups based on perceived physical differences. Ethnicity represents culture, language, and geographical differences. And there's general agreement that race and ethnicity are are basically proxies for various structural and social factors, sometimes called structural and social determinants. And some examples include structural factors would be things like healthcare access, educational quality. Social factors could be things like race-related discrimination or acculturation. And we need to assess these various factors, and there are many of them, as mediators and moderators of these racial and ethnic group differences in cognitive and brain aging. Basically, we don't think there's anything inherently biological about race and ethnicity that are underlying these differences, these disparities that I'll talk about. So there's much we don't know about these modifiable dementia risk factors. For example, and this has been mentioned already, do these modifiable factors, midlife obesity, et cetera, carry similar risk across racial and ethnic groups? The data I just presented, this is important, assume that those dementia risk factors carry the same risk across groups. But of course, most of what we know about the risk that those risk factors carry comes from studies of non-Hispanic white people, not diverse samples and not different subgroups. So we really don't have good data to answer this question yet. So, and one factor that I'll talk a little bit about that we study in my lab is depression. So racial and ethnic minorities are underrepresented in effective neuroscience. And this is really important because emerging work from epidemiological studies suggests that although diagnosed depression is less common in minoritized groups than it is in non-Hispanic whites, when depressive episodes are observed, they tend to be more severe and predictive of worse cognitive outcomes. Compare in minoritized groups like Black participants has been studied the most compared to non-Hispanic white, particularly in older adult people. We don't know, though, the extent to which depressive symptoms on a range of severity and age interact to impact cognition and brain health in minoritized adults across the lifespan. In a recent study from my lab, we've been looking at this. We measured executive functioning and volume of the prefrontal cortex and other regions too, regions that support executive functioning. And we find, is this the pointer? Yeah, here we go. Okay, so we're finding this interaction in which in the Black and Mexican American group, and these are middle-aged people, we're finding that people who have a higher level of depression, actually across groups, have lower executive functioning. And this is worse is higher on the y-axis here. But only in the Black and Mexican American group do we find this interaction where age exacerbates the negative impact of depressive symptoms on executive functioning. And we find this similar, what we call kind of a double jeopardy effect, age interacting with depression severity, in brain volume, where people who are older, higher level of depression, have a lower prefrontal cortical volume. And this is only true in the Black and Mexican American middle-aged group. So this data is important. It's important to highlight that it's a middle-age sample because this suggests that these racial and ethnic disparities and the negative impact of mental health, depression on cognition may arise even in middle age. So a big question is why? Why is this double jeopardy effect stronger for the racial and ethnic minority group? And we don't know from that data alone, but some likely possibilities include things like vascular disease, for which we know that there is a disparity where it's higher in minoritized groups in the literature. So, for example, we can use MRI. Using MRI, we can measure white matter hyperintensities, which are indicative of demyelination and axon loss, kind of a marker of a vascular disease marker. And it's an important variable to measure clinically because it's been associated with stroke, increased risk of stroke, brain atrophy, cognitive impairment, and dementia. Importantly, white matter hyperintensities are precipitated by the presence of malleable factors like smoking, hypertension, diabetes, which are also more prevalent in these minoritized groups. I'll make the point here that those risk factors are also more prevalent because of racial and ethnic disparities and structural factors like healthcare access. So we have found a disproportionate impact of white matter hyperintensity burden in the prefrontal cortex, down here on the x-axis, on depression severity, level of depression in Black, middle-aged and older people, and older adults in this study actually, than in non-Hispanic white adults. But a question that we're investigating now that we don't know the answer to is whether vascular disease, as measured with, for example, white matter hyperintensities and other race-related proxy factors, may explain these depression-related memory impairments, particularly in Black and Mexican American adults. So turning to another risk factor that may carry greater dementia risk for minoritized people or some minoritized groups, using data from the health and retirement study, Deb Embrenson and colleagues recently showed that losing a child in midlife or prior to midlife rather, carries a higher dementia risk in Black than in non-Hispanic white adults. It carries a higher risk for everybody bereaved relative to non-bereaved parents, but the risk is higher for the non-Hispanic Black participants. And in this study, they found that this association between bereavement and dementia was no longer significant after controlling for things like alcohol use, heavy alcohol use rather, heavy smoking, and psychological distress that reported to arise following the death of one's child in midlife. And this is important because we know that Black parents are more likely to suffer the death of a child early in their lives than our non-Hispanic white parents. So sleep is another one of these factors that has been associated, emerging data suggesting it's maybe associated with Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment. It's hugely, I mean, I study sleep. We all love sleep, right? It's hugely important for many facets of health and cognition. One example is its connection to Alzheimer's disease. So this is from a study, a longitudinal study looking at sleep, habitual sleep quality measured in people who are cognitively unimpaired older people at baseline, and then 6 years later following them cognitively. And people who were classified as highly fragmented sleepers, kind of waking up throughout the night or perhaps having variable sleep night to night, were more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 6 years later and at a faster rate than minimally fragmented sleepers. So very little work has examined the relationship between poor sleep and cognitive impairment and decline in minoritized populations, despite well-known disparities in sleep quality and quantity between these minoritized and non-Hispanic white groups. So we've found some results recently that are consistent with this idea that sleep may be particularly an important factor in cognition in minoritized people. So we've been investigating the influence of habitual sleep patterns measured over a week or more on episodic memory performance. And in this particular study, we're looking at sleep-dependent memory consolidation over memory retention over a sleep interval. And we find that poor sleep is associated with worse memory retention in middle-aged and older adults, but particularly in the Black group compared to the non-Hispanic white group. So what could the reason for this be? This, disproportionate relationship in the Black participant group, we don't know, but there are likely other factors that could interact synergistically with sleep quality. For example, race-related stress is one that we've examined and has been kind of talked about a little bit today. So we asked people to answer a questionnaire on a Likert scale. How strongly do they endorse these particular statements? I'm not sure if you can read them well, but so for example, you've been subjected to racist jokes by whites, non-Blacks in positions of authority, and you did not protest for fear they might have held it against you. You notice that when Black people are killed by the police, the media informs the public of the victim's criminal record or negative information in their background, suggesting they got what they deserved. So people who endorse those statements more highly have worse quality sleep. And we found this was a partial mediator of some of our effects that I just presented. You might wonder why non-Hispanic white people are able to fill out this questionnaire, and most don't, but those who have like a Black partner, for example, and felt that they could respond with their own personal experience or from their own personal experience could fill this out. And that's accepted in this particular questionnaire. So we've also been exploring some positive factors. I always want to think about positive moderating variables, things like religiosity. So religiosity is something that tends to be higher in the minoritized groups that we study, like Black participants and Mexican American participants, the two that we study the most in my lab. What we find in just this one example is that religiosity, people who are higher on religiosity, statements, endorsing these statements like, how often do you attend church? Or in my life, I experience the presence of the divine. There are a whole slew of questions. People who are higher in religiosity in the green line there and have, high religiosity attenuates the negative impact of poor sleep on race-related stress on poor sleep. So religiosity may be one of these protective factors. We've been exploring this, and we've also explored acculturation in some of our Mexican-American participants. So I'm going to end just by talking about some of these open questions and next step ideas, which have also been sort of the other speakers have kind of set the stage nicely for. So, most of the studies that exist today have used standardized neuropsychological tests to assess cognition that have been, data have been gathered and normed on weird samples, as Karen mentioned earlier. So what we don't know is if these disparities in cognition and ADRD, as measured by these tests, are related to non-biological factors, things like test-taking familiarity or language, proficiency, things like this, education. It's important to also measure change over time because some of those biases that I just mentioned are likely stable over time or relatively stable. So we may see longitudinally a lower kind of group difference in cognition than if we measure just cross-sectionally. We don't know, as I mentioned earlier, the extent to which certain risk factors like midlife obesity mediate cognitive decline for these different racial and ethnic groups. So we really need to measure multiple factors within different subgroups. And we need to implement tailored interventions, right? So perhaps a dietary intervention may not be great for every group or every person. Or religiosity may not be the answer, not that it is an answer, but it may not be the best kind of protective factor for everybody too. And then to what extent do social cultural specific factors, things like religiosity, acculturation, et cetera, mediate or moderate disparities in cognition, dementia, and brain health? And many of these are multifaceted. So religiosity is multifaceted, right? It's composed of social support, emotion regulation, mental stimulation. So we really need to look at all of these facets of these various factors. We need to work with communities of interest to identify what these factors are, because we don't necessarily know what they all might be. And take a life course approach, which has also been mentioned today, to identify sensitive period for some of these factors. And I'll just end by thanking my collaborators and everybody here. Thank you.